Hey there, Night Owl. Welcome back to another extremely uneventful historical bedtime story. Tonight, we're gliding softly into parchment, powdered wigs, and far too many opinions about government structure. So, dim the lights, settle under your blanket, maybe pour yourself a sleepy tea, preferably one not taxed by the British anymore. Because tonight, we're talking about the U.S. Constitution. That miraculous document born from long arguments, sweaty rooms, and a group of men who couldn't agree on anything except that George Washington looked great in uniform. Let's drift back to the late 1780s, a time when the United States was still more of a united awkward friendship than an actual country. The Revolutionary War had ended. Britain had packed up and left, muttering something about good luck with that. But the shiny new America wasn't exactly running smoothly. They had something called the Articles of Confederation, which honestly sounded impressive, but worked about as well as a group project where nobody does their part. Every state had its own rules, its own money, and apparently its own ego. Congress could technically request money from states, but couldn't make them pay. So, imagine running a government where your main power is politely asking people for cash and hoping they don't ignore your messages. Yeah, it went about as well as you'd expect. Let's float into 1786 to a man named Daniel Shays. He was a farmer and a veteran who decided, quite rationally, that he didn't feel like paying unfair taxes. So, he started a rebellion in Massachusetts. It wasn't exactly an organized revolution, more like a bunch of angry farmers with pitchforks and poor financial literacy. But it scared everyone in power. Because if a few thousand farmers could just decide, nah, to taxes, what's to stop anyone else? The elites started to panic. George Washington, who had retired and was living his best post-war life, kept getting letters basically saying, hey, remember that whole freedom thing? Yeah, it's falling apart. So, they decided to hold a meeting. And not just any meeting, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It was held in Philadelphia because apparently it was the only city big enough to contain that much ego and humidity at once. Let's gently pan across the scene. Picture a dim, stuffy room in Independence Hall. Windows nailed shut to keep out eavesdroppers. Men in heavy wool coats. It's June. There's no air conditioning. And yet, they somehow managed to write one of the most important documents in history, instead of passing out from heat stroke. The man presiding over it all? Of course, Washington. Tall, dignified, and probably silently judging everyone. He had tried to retire, but apparently America just couldn't function without him standing in the corner looking majestic. Then there was James Madison, small, serious, and determined to create something actually functional. He'd been obsessively studying ancient governments like some kind of nerdy historian before it was cool. He came prepared with what he called the Virginia Plan, which, in short, said, let's give the national government actual power, because this whole state friendship thing isn't working. The plan was bold, maybe too bold. Some delegates thought it sounded a little too centralized, like, hello, Monarchy 2.0. So immediately, everyone started arguing. Benjamin Franklin was there too, old, frail, and probably the only one with actual wisdom. He was 81, which in 1787 was practically ancient. He often had to be carried to the sessions in a sedan chair, which is honestly the kind of entrance everyone should aspire to. Whenever the debates got too heated, Franklin would say something like, "Gentlemen, we are all fallible," which was polite founding father speak for, "You're all being ridiculous." Now, the delegates had one main goal: fix the government. But of course, being humans, they immediately disagreed on what fix meant. Big states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal votes. It was basically the 18th century version of, why does California get all the attention? After weeks of heated debate, and by heated, I mean both emotionally and literally, they came up with what's now known as the Great Compromise. Two houses of Congress, one based on population, the House of Representatives, and one with equal votes per state, the Senate. It was a miracle of balance, really. Or, as one historian put it, a solution everyone hated just enough to agree on. Then came the question of slavery. Ah, yes, the great moral disaster of early America. The southern states didn't want to give up their peculiar institution, as they called it. The northern delegates didn't like it either, but not enough to actually ban it. So they reached what we now call the 3/5 compromise. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for representation. It was a grotesque arithmetic of humanity, but again, they called it compromise. Madison and others knew it was morally rotten, but they decided to deal with it later, because apparently future generations could handle that mess. Spoiler, they couldn't. By September 1787, after 4 months of debate, sweat, and snarky letters home, they finally finished the Constitution. And honestly, it was kind of brilliant. Checks, balances, separation of powers, all those buzzwords we pretend to understand today. They handed George Washington the final draft. He signed it with his usual calm authority, probably relieved to escape that humid nightmare. Not everyone was thrilled, though. Several delegates refused to sign. They thought it gave too much power to the federal government. One of them, George Mason, said, "I would sooner chop off my right hand than sign that Constitution." He then, presumably, left with both hands intact. When the document went out to the states for ratification, the chaos didn't stop. There were two camps, Federalists who liked it and Anti-Federalists who didn't. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, the kind of man who wrote essays for fun, and James Madison, the Constitution's anxious dad. They started publishing the Federalist Papers, 85 essays explaining why the Constitution was actually a good idea. It was like the world's longest PR campaign. Hamilton wrote most of them late at night, which explains the manic tone of some. Madison wrote a few calm, reasoned ones, and John Jay contributed until he got sick and stopped, which feels relatable. Eventually, after months of debate, promises, and thinly veiled threats, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. And to sweeten the deal, they agreed to add a Bill of Rights, just to reassure everyone that no, the government couldn't suddenly outlaw freedom of speech or quarter soldiers in your guest room. George Washington became the first president under this new system. He didn't even want the job, but predictably, everyone insisted. So he did it because that's what George did. Reluctantly lead the country, gracefully set precedents, and somehow make it all look effortless. Let's gently drift back for a moment. Imagine that room again. The ink still drying, the windows creaking, the founders probably exhausted. They had just created a framework that would last centuries through wars, crises, and far too many lawyers. But they probably didn't feel triumphant. Mostly, they just felt done. Because the Constitution wasn't a divine revelation. It was the product of human bickering, compromise, and sheer fatigue. And maybe that's why it works. Because it was written not by saints, but by men who just wanted to go home. Now, as the candlelight fades and the delegates drift into history, let's pause our quiet journey here. In part 2, we'll float into the strange and personal lives of those same founders, their secrets, scandals, and slightly awkward marriages. Because behind every line of the Constitution was a very tired man with questionable health and even more questionable decisions. So, close your eyes, breathe out slowly, and remember, even the greatest nations begin with messy meetings and bad ventilation.
Welcome back, fellow insomniac. Let's slip quietly back into the late 18th century, that golden age of waistcoats, questionable hygiene, and powdered hair. In Part 1, we watched the Constitution emerge from a cloud of sweat and compromise. Now we'll wander softly through the private lives of the men who built it, or at least tolerated each other long enough to sign it. Because while they looked noble in portraits, the reality was, let's just say, slightly less majestic. Most of them were either broke, sick, or deeply dramatic, sometimes all three at once. Let's start, naturally, with George Washington, America's first president, the Marble Man, the one who could stand in complete silence and somehow make everyone feel guilty for not being as composed. Washington was, by all accounts, obsessed with dignity. He knew people watched his every move, so he lived his entire adult life as though he was constantly being painted in oil. He spoke rarely, smiled carefully, and wrote letters about the importance of moral character, even though, privately, he was exhausted. Years of war had left him with chronic pain, bad teeth, and a general sense that leadership was overrated. And yes, about those teeth, let's clear something up. They were not made of wood. They were made of a horrifying combination of human teeth, cow teeth, and ivory. Basically, George was a walking dental nightmare. He hated smiling in public, and most of his portraits politely ignored that he could barely chew. His home life at Mount Vernon was peaceful, though, in a restrained, awkward way. He and Martha had no biological children, which was one of Washington's quiet heartbreaks. They raised her 2 kids from a previous marriage instead. He loved them, but also found them slightly annoying, which feels like the most relatable thing about him. In private letters, Washington often complained about visitors who wouldn't leave. Imagine spending 8 years in war, finally retiring, and suddenly your house turns into a non-stop tourist attraction. People would show up just to see him eat dinner. He once wrote that he longed for tranquility and shade, which is an elegant 18th century way of saying, I just want to nap. Now, let's float over to Thomas Jefferson, the idealist philosopher with a side hustle in hypocrisy. He wrote all men are created equal, while personally owning hundreds of enslaved people. It's the kind of contradiction you could only get away with in the 1700s, or politics in general. Jefferson was elegant, brilliant, and broke. Always broke. He had expensive tastes, fine wine, architecture, imported furniture, and absolutely no budgeting skills. By the time he died, he was so deep in debt that his estate had to be sold off just to cover it. Monticello, his famous home, was his personal obsession. He designed it, redesigned it, and then redesigned it again, forever chasing the perfect view of himself as a gentleman architect. He filled it with gadgets, dumbwaiters, rotating bookstands, and an early copy machine. He was like an Enlightenment-era tech nerd, constantly tinkering with things nobody else understood. But for all his intellect, Jefferson was a man of contradictions. He dreamed of liberty, but built it on the backs of others. He hated public speaking, but loved writing long letters. And his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman and half-sister of his late wife, has become one of the most haunting parts of his story. They had several children together, though Jefferson never publicly acknowledged them. It's one of those quiet, complicated tragedies that sits right under the surface of all his noble words. Jefferson spent his final years at Monticello writing about philosophy and agriculture while his finances crumbled. He died in 1826 on July 4th of all days, because apparently the Founding Fathers had a flair for dramatic timing even in death. Speaking of John Adams, let's drift to him next, the anxious, brilliant, perpetually grumpy intellectual. Adams was the kind of man who always thought he was right, which made him both effective and insufferable. He could turn any dinner conversation into a constitutional argument. Even his friends admitted he had the personality of a thunderstorm. But Adams had one great saving grace: his wife, Abigail. She was smart, sharp-tongued, and endlessly patient. Their letters to each other are among the most honest and tender of the era. While he was off in Europe trying to negotiate peace treaties and accidentally offending everyone, she was running their farm and managing finances. They were a team, and probably one of the healthiest marriages in early American politics, which isn't saying much. As president, though, Adams didn't have a great time. He came right after Washington, which is basically like following Beyoncé at karaoke night. His administration was marked by infighting, foreign threats, and his biggest mistake, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made criticizing the government a crime. Because, apparently, nothing says freedom than arresting people for mean tweets in 1798. After losing the presidency to Jefferson, Adams quietly retreated home to Massachusetts, where he lived to the age of 90. He spent his old age reading, complaining, and occasionally writing long letters about how everyone misunderstood him, which, to be fair, they probably did. Now, let's drift to Benjamin Franklin, who by the time of the Constitution was already a walking legend. Inventor, writer, diplomat, and professional old man. Franklin's later years were spent mostly in Philadelphia, where he alternated between scientific experiments and giving unwanted advice to everyone. He was the oldest delegate at the Constitutional Convention, and honestly, he looked the part. Gout, kidney stones, and chronic pain, yet somehow still the funniest man in the room. Franklin loved gossip, good wine, and subtle chaos. He once said that wine was proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy, which tells you everything about his priorities. Franklin's personal life was unconventional. He had one common-law wife, Deborah, whom he never legally married, and an estranged son, William, who remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution. They never fully reconciled. So, for all his wit and worldly charm, Franklin ended life quietly, lonely, revered, and slightly disappointed in humanity. And then there was Alexander Hamilton, the human embodiment of caffeine. He wrote, argued, and schemed faster than anyone could keep up with. He was the kind of man who treated every disagreement as a duel, sometimes literally. Born in the Caribbean to unmarried parents, Hamilton rose through sheer brilliance and ambition. He became Washington's right-hand man, helped write the Federalist Papers, and basically invented the American financial system. Unfortunately, his confidence bordered on self-destructive. He picked fights with everyone: Jefferson, Adams, Burr, even Washington sometimes. It's like he couldn't stand the idea of silence. His downfall came, of course, with Aaron Burr, the duel. A quiet morning in July 1804. Hamilton fired first, perhaps deliberately missing. Burr did not. And just like that, the man who never stopped talking was permanently quiet. Hamilton's wife, Eliza, outlived him by 50 years. She spent her life preserving his legacy and quietly cleaning up the mess he left behind. If there was ever a founding father who deserved a Netflix drama, it was her. And finally, let's float toward one of the quieter founders, James Madison, the father of the Constitution himself. Madison was small, frail, and shy, not exactly the image of a political titan. He often spoke so softly that people had to lean in to hear him. But when he did speak, it mattered. His notes from the Constitutional Convention remain one of the most detailed records of what actually happened in that hot and argumentative summer. Madison married Dolly Payne Todd, who, likely unlike him, was pure social energy. She was charming, fashionable, and famously good at throwing parties. Together, they balanced each other out. He was theory and structure. She was warmth and presence. In a sea of powdered wigs and serious faces, Dolly was the one who remembered to smile. Madison eventually became president, overseeing the War of 1812, which was basically a messy sequel to the Revolution. His capital got burned down, but he stayed calm, which is about all you can do when your government literally goes up in flames. After his presidency, Madison retired to Montpelier, where he quietly managed his papers and worried about
his legacy. He lived long enough to see the early sparks of sectional division that would eventually lead to the Civil War, a future he could already sense but not stop. He died in 1836, the last of the major founders, as if closing the curtain on an era. And there they were, the architects of American government, brilliant, flawed, argumentative men who built a nation while slowly falling apart themselves. Their public lives were filled with grand speeches and ideals. Their private lives were filled with debt, illness, and regret. Yet somehow, between the contradictions, the mistakes, and the powdered wigs, they created something lasting. Not perfect, never perfect, but enduring. And maybe that's the real story, that human imperfection, written in ink and compromise, can somehow become a country. In the next part, we'll drift forward a little, into the early republic itself, the strange experiments of the first presidents, the awkwardness of creating traditions from scratch, and the quiet, weird, sometimes petty birth of American politics. So stay cozy. We'll pick up there, when the lights of the 18th century fade and the sleepy republic begins to dream.
Hey again, Night Wanderer. If you're still awake, congratulations! You've outlasted at least 3 founding fathers' lifespans by now. But don't worry, this part is even quieter. Tonight, we're floating through the early years of the New Republic, a time when the United States was basically a toddler with a constitution. There were rules, yes, there was structure, but there was also confusion, endless paperwork, and a lot of men in ruffled shirts arguing about how to interpret words like necessary and proper. Let's start, naturally, with George Washington's presidency, because nobody else was brave enough to go first. Imagine being handed a brand new country and no guidebook. There were no how to be president manuals, no examples, no office furniture. They had to make it all up as they went along. Washington, of course, approached the presidency the same way he did everything, calmly, cautiously, and with a kind of noble dread. He knew every move he made would set a precedent. So he spent most of his first term trying not to accidentally invent a monarchy. He held formal dinners, but refused to call them royal banquets. He accepted visitors, but not too many, because apparently shaking hands was considered too casual. He wanted the people to respect the office, but not think he was a king. It was a delicate balance, part democracy, part theater. The early cabinet meetings were like awkward group projects. You had Washington in the middle, Hamilton on one side, Jefferson on the other, 2 geniuses, 2 egos, 1 poor president trying to keep the peace. Hamilton believed in a strong central government and a modern economy. Jefferson wanted small government, yeoman farmers, and peace and quiet. So basically, it was Wall Street versus cottagecore, 18th century edition. And it got ugly fast. Hamilton started the Bank of the United States, Jefferson called it unconstitutional, and the argument spiraled into an all-out ideological war. Washington mostly sighed and tried to focus on neutrality, which, as it turns out, nobody liked. And then came foreign policy, the true sleep aid of the 1790s. Europe was at war again, because, of course it was, and the young U.S. had to decide whether to join in or just quietly mind its own business. Washington chose neutrality, issuing the famous Proclamation of 1793, which basically said, "We're not picking sides. Please stop asking." It made sense. The U.S. had no navy, no money, and no appetite for another war, but it also made everyone mad. The French felt betrayed, the British were still cranky, and half of Congress thought Washington was being too cautious. He finished 2 terms, then shocked everyone by retiring voluntarily. This in itself was revolutionary. Most leaders in history had to be removed by force. Washington just said, "I'm good," and went home to his farm. He left behind a quiet precedent that power could be passed peacefully. And then, because he was George Washington, he immediately started worrying about his crops again. Next up was James Adams, the first presidential runner-up turned actual president. He'd been Washington's vice president, a job he famously called the most insignificant office ever invented. So when he finally got promoted, he probably expected a little more excitement. Instead, he got chaos. France was angry about U.S. neutrality, so Adams had to deal with something called the Quasi-War, which was appropriately only sort of a war. It involved naval skirmishes, angry letters, and a lot of diplomatic sulking. During this time, Adams also signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allowing the government to jail anyone who criticized it. Yes, that's right. The guy who helped write the Declaration of Independence made it illegal to insult the government. Irony level? Expert. Even his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson, thought he'd gone too far, which made their cabinet meetings tense, to say the least. Eventually, Adams lost re-election to Jefferson in 1800, one of the first peaceful transfers of power in world history. And while Adams was disappointed, he still quietly packed up and went home, probably muttering the entire carriage ride. Now, Jefferson's presidency was supposed to be a fresh start, a return to simplicity, calm, and small government. He even skipped the fancy inauguration parade and just walked to the Capitol. Very man of the people, very relatable. Except he still owned a mansion and several enslaved people, but details. As president, Jefferson's main accomplishment was the Louisiana Purchase, where he basically doubled the size of the country for about 4 cents an acre. It was the best real estate deal in history, and he didn't technically have the constitutional authority to do it. He just did it anyway, because when it's a good deal, you don't overthink it. Then came the Lewis and Clark expedition, Jefferson's idea of a science project. He sent 2 guys and a small team to explore the new territory, map it out, and, ideally, not die. They actually succeeded, which shocked everyone, including Jefferson. But Jefferson's second term wasn't as fun. Britain and France kept bullying American ships, so he came up with the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically banned all trade. It was meant to punish Europe, but it ended up punishing American merchants instead. The economy tanked. Jefferson retired soon after, claiming he was happy to go back to farming, though he still spent the rest of his life trying to fix his debt problem, which, spoiler, never happened. Next, James Madison. Quiet, serious, and probably wondering why he ever left philosophy for politics. His presidency began peacefully, but quickly spiraled into another war with Britain, the War of 1812, which, fun fact, was neither necessary nor victorious. It started over trade restrictions and British impressment of American sailors, basically naval bullying. At one point, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House. Madison fled the city with important papers, while Dolly Madison famously saved the portrait of George Washington, because apparently even during a national crisis, preserving art was still a priority. The war ended in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, which restored everything to how it was before, meaning thousands died for absolutely nothing. Still, Madison left office respected for his steadiness, and possibly for having the most composed wife in American history. And then, Well, the peace didn't last, because after the gentle lull of the early republic came the roaring mess of Andrew Jackson and the rise of political parties. But that's a louder story for another night. For now, let's stay in the quiet part of history, where the ink of the Constitution was still drying and the ideals still glowed faintly in candlelight, where men in powdered wigs genuinely believed they were building something eternal, and against all odds, kind of did. So as we fade out of the 1810s, picture America as a young republic drifting off to sleep. The Capitol still half-built, the roads muddy, the economy fragile, but the experiment still alive. The founders were mostly gone, buried under stone monuments and long speeches, but their words, their compromises, and their carefully argued ideals lingered, like the faint smell of wax and ink in an empty hall. And maybe that's the true magic of this early period, that the most powerful nation in the world started as a group project held together by hope, coffee, and passive-aggressive letters.
Hey again, late listener. You've made it this far, which means either you really love early American history, or you're finally starting to drift off. Either way, let's keep things slow, steady, and slightly sarcastic, like a history teacher who's already halfway to retirement. When we left off, the United States was young, hopeful, and only mildly dysfunctional. By the 1820s, it had started to grow in land, in ambition, and unfortunately, in self-confidence. This was the age of westward expansion, the age when Americans looked at a continent and collectively decided, yeah, that's all ours now. Let's start with James Monroe, because his presidency was the calm before the storm. He had that whole era of good feelings thing going, which, to be fair, mostly meant nobody could be bothered to form new political parties for a few years. People felt optimistic, the country was stable, and for a brief moment, it almost looked like this whole democracy experiment might actually work. But, as with most human things, it didn't last. Beneath the surface, deep cracks were forming. Regional tensions, slavery debates, economic inequality. You know, the usual prelude to disaster. And those cracks were about to split wide open with the election of 1824, also known as the corrupt bargain. 4 men ran for president: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. None of them won a majority, so the decision went to the House of Representatives. And there, Henry Clay conveniently supported John Quincy Adams, who in turn made Clay his Secretary of State. Jackson, who'd actually won the popular vote, lost, and he was furious. He called it corruption, betrayal, and basically spent the next 4 years plotting revenge. So much for good feelings. Let's float over to John Quincy Adams, the 6th president and son of the famously cranky John Adams. John Quincy was intelligent, eloquent, and about as charismatic as a damp envelope. He preferred reading to politicking, which is admirable, but not great when your job is politics. He had grand ideas: canals, universities, observatories. Basically, he wanted to turn America into an Enlightenment theme park. But Congress didn't share his enthusiasm. After 1 term of frustration and near constant obstruction, Adams lost re-election to the man who'd been waiting in the wings, Andrew Jackson, the war hero with a chip on his shoulder and a sword in his hand. And here's where America got loud. Andrew Jackson was the first president to really embody the common man. He wasn't from the coastal elite. He was rough, temperamental, and proudly unrefined, the kind of guy who'd duel someone for looking at him funny. In fact, he did, multiple times. He even killed a man in one of them.
So yes, the White House now had an actual killer in it. Jackson's inauguration was pure chaos. He opened the White House to the public, and thousands of people showed up. They trampled the furniture, spilled punch on the carpets, and broke plates. It looked less like a celebration and more like a frat party hosted by powdered wig revolutionaries. The elite were horrified. Jackson was thrilled. He saw himself as the voice of the people, or at least the people who looked like him. He hated the national bank, distrusted paper money, and had a deep, almost personal vendetta against the wealthy Eastern elite. He called himself a defender of democracy, even as he strengthened presidential power to nearly monarchical levels. He vetoed bills with gusto, ignored court rulings he didn't like, and fired people who disagreed with him. Checks and balances? Cute idea, not really his thing. And then there was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, his most infamous decision. Under Jackson's order, thousands of Native Americans were forcibly moved west of the Mississippi River, a journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. It was a national tragedy, one wrapped in rhetoric about progress and civilization, as if those words could hide the suffering underneath. He called it necessary. History calls it cruel. He left office with enormous popularity and equally enormous controversy. Even in retirement, he remained a loud political force, basically America's first ex-president influencer. After Jackson came Martin Van Buren, his political protege, calm, cautious, and unfortunately doomed to face an economic collapse almost immediately. The Panic of 1837 hit, banks failed, unemployment soared, and Van Buren got blamed for everything. He spent most of his presidency defending himself against forces he couldn't control. He lost re-election easily, mostly because nobody wants a president who uses the phrase financial panic too often. Then came William Henry Harrison, who decided to prove that campaign slogans could kill. He ran on being a tough frontier hero and gave a famously long inaugural speech, in cold rain, without a coat. 31 days later, he died of pneumonia. Shortest presidency in American history. The moral? Always wear a coat. Enter John Tyler, his vice president, who immediately declared himself the new president, to everyone's surprise. People called him his accidency, which is a brutal nickname for a man just trying his best. Tyler vetoed almost everything Congress passed, got kicked out of his own party, and ended his presidency as basically a political ghost. He later sided with the Confederacy, because apparently he hadn't caused enough trouble already. After him came James K. Polk, the most efficient man ever to hold office. He promised 4 things: settle the Oregon boundary, cut tariffs, create an independent treasury, and expand the country to the Pacific. He did all 4 in one term and retired. No fuss, no drama, just pure sleep-inducing competence. Unfortunately, his biggest accomplishment, the Mexican-American War, was also one of the most controversial. It expanded U.S. territory massively, but it also reignited the slavery debate, because every new state raised the same old question: free or slave? And with every answer came more anger, more tension, and more foreshadowing for the disaster to come. Now we glide gently into the 1850s, a decade that somehow managed to be both boring and catastrophic. The country kept trying to compromise over slavery, compromise after compromise. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each one promised peace. Each one made everything worse. Bleeding Kansas broke out, a literal mini-civil war over whether Kansas would enter as free or slave state. Senators started physically attacking each other on the Senate floor. It was the least civilized decade in civilization. Then came James Buchanan, the president who watched the country collapse and decided his best strategy was to just do nothing. He's often ranked among the worst presidents in history, not because he caused the Civil War, but because he just kind of sat there and let it happen. Leadership through inertia. It's a bold strategy. By 1860, the cracks that had been forming since the Constitution were finally splitting open. The dream of unity, the delicate balance between liberty and hypocrisy, all of it was about to come undone. And yet, in this still, dark prelude, America was still pretending everything would somehow be fine, that compromise would save them again, that no one would ever actually go to war with their own countrymen. History, of course, had other plans. Let's pause here. You can almost feel the tension rising, the quiet before the storm, the last candle flickering before the room goes dark. The sleepy republic was about to awaken violently. But for now, let's stay in the calm. The sound of ink scratching on parchment, the hum of distant debate, and the faint echo of a country still believing in its myths.
Hey again, Night Owl. You're still here, which either means you love long-form history, or you've reached that nice floaty stage between consciousness and dreamland. Perfect timing, because now we arrive at the part where the United States decides to argue itself into oblivion. Let's set the scene. It's 1860. The air smells faintly of tobacco, ego, and bad compromises. For decades, America had tried to hold itself together with duct tape and idealism. The founders had left the slavery issue unresolved, assuming someone else would figure it out later. Well, it's later now. And that someone else turned out to be Abraham Lincoln, a tall, melancholy lawyer from Illinois who spoke softly and thought deeply, which in politics was already suspicious behavior. Lincoln's rise was unexpected. He wasn't from a powerful family, he had no money, no fancy education, and he looked more like a stretched-out question mark than a national hero. But he had a way with words, calm, steady, logical, the kind of speech that made even his enemies stop and think, if only for a second. When he won the presidency in 1860, the South panicked like someone had just told them taxes were going up and the world was ending. Before Lincoln even took office, 7 states seceded. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, which sounds official until you remember they were basically a club of angry planters declaring independence over the right to own people. Lincoln tried to stay calm. He said he had no intention of ending slavery where it already existed. He just didn't want it spreading into new territories. A position so mild it would have been boring if it hadn't set off the bloodiest war in American history. The war began in 1861 at Fort Sumter, when Confederate forces decided diplomacy was overrated and opened fire on a U.S. garrison. Lincoln called for volunteers. The Union rallied. The South dug in. And suddenly, the experiment in liberty was at war with itself. But don't worry, we're not doing the dramatic version. This isn't a battlefield documentary. We're staying slow, quiet, and observational. The kind of Civil War story you can fall asleep to. So let's talk less about gunfire and more about people. The Civil War wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a national nervous breakdown. Brothers literally fought brothers. Towns split down the middle. Families stopped talking to each other over politics, a charming American tradition that never quite went away. In the North, life was hard but stable. Factories churned, newspapers raged, and Lincoln aged about 20 years in 4. He carried the entire country's grief in his face, that long, weary, compassionate stare that said, "Yes, I see the chaos. Please stop making it worse." In the South, daily life became survival. Blockades strangled the economy. Men vanished to fight, never to return. Cities burned, plantations collapsed, and states' rights turned out to be less fun when there weren't enough shoes. Both sides convinced themselves that God was on their team, which statistically speaking, he wasn't thrilled about. And through it all, Lincoln stayed calm. He wrote letters full of sorrow and dry humor. He joked when he could, grieved when he must, and kept his focus on one impossible task: holding a country together that clearly didn't want to be. By 1863, the war had dragged on far longer than anyone expected. That's when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebel states to be free. It didn't free everyone immediately, but it transformed the war's purpose. Now it wasn't just about preserving the Union, it was about redefining it. He delivered the Gettysburg Address later that year. Just 272 words, short enough to memorize, profound enough to echo for centuries. It wasn't loud or grand, just quiet, deliberate poetry about sacrifice and renewal. The kind of speech that makes you want to sit in silence afterward. But even as victory crept closer, Lincoln's weariness deepened. He spent nights wandering the White House halls, reading poetry, telling melancholy jokes to visitors. He dreamed of his own death more than once, which, in retrospect, feels less like symbolism and more like foreshadowing with manners. In April 1865, just days after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the war was finally over. The Union had survived. The Confederacy was gone. Slavery was abolished, at least on paper. And Lincoln? He went to the theater. You already know the rest. John Wilkes Booth, a desperate actor with delusions of grandeur, ended the president's life in one careless moment of hate. The nation mourned, stunned and silent, as if someone had turned out the lights in the middle of a long, restless night. Lincoln became a myth almost instantly. The gentle martyr, the philosopher president, the man who saved the Union. But maybe the real story is simpler. He was tired, he was kind, he was trying to hold together a dream that was fraying at every edge, and when it finally broke, he still believed it could be mended. After him came Andrew Johnson, who proved that sometimes fate overcorrects. Johnson was crude, stubborn, and deeply unprepared for the job. He opposed almost every effort to rebuild the South fairly. Congress tried to impeach him and almost succeeded. The country lurched through Reconstruction like a sleepwalker bumping into walls. For a while, it seemed like all the suffering might actually mean something. New amendments promised equality. Freed people built schools, communities, and churches. But white resentment didn't disappear. It just changed uniforms. And soon enough, the same old systems crept back under new names. Let's drift now, away from the battlefields and back to the broader view. By 1870, the United States was technically whole again, but emotionally shattered. The Constitution had survived, barely. It had been rewritten, stretched, interpreted, and patched up like a tiled old quilt holding too many memories. And through it all, the same paradox remained. A country built on freedom, struggling with its own definition of it. That paradox hums in the background, like the low sound of a ticking clock. It's quiet, persistent,
and impossible to tune out completely. So as the fires cooled and the cities rebuilt, America fell into a different kind of sleep, the restless slumber of a nation pretending to be fine. Factories rose, railroads expanded, money flowed, and people called it progress, as if industrial smoke could erase the smell of old blood. It was the beginning of the Gilded Age, shiny on the surface, corroded underneath. A time of tycoons, robber barons, and presidents you'll never remember because they were basically human wallpaper. But we'll get there soon enough. For now, let's stay in the soft aftermath, the quiet breathing of a country that somehow is still alive. Because next time, in part 6, we'll sink into that strange golden twilight, the Gilded Age, when America fell asleep on a pile of money. So rest your eyes. The war is over, the dream continues, and as always, history keeps whispering. Softly, ironically, inevitably.
Hey again, Night Wanderer. Let's keep that sleepy rhythm going. Breathe in, breathe out, and imagine the 1870s. The war is over, the flags are folded, and the sound of hammering railroads is echoing from coast to coast. The United States had survived its greatest self-destruction, and now it was entering what historians and a few cynical journalists would later call the Gilded Age. The phrase comes from Mark Twain, who basically meant, "It looks fancy, but don't look too close." Think of it like a mansion with gold wallpaper hiding cracks in the walls. After Lincoln's death and the exhausting drama of Reconstruction, the country wanted normalcy, or at least the illusion of it. Enter a parade of presidents so quietly forgettable you could mix them up like identical teabags. First came Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero who looked like he wanted to go back to bed halfway through every cabinet meeting. Grant was brave, honest, and completely out of his depth in politics. He trusted people too easily, which is how half of his administration ended up in scandals involving railroads, whiskey, and things politely labeled financial irregularities. He wasn't corrupt himself, just surrounded by it, like a kind man in a room full of raccoons. Still, he stabilized the economy, fought the early Ku Klux Klan, and somehow managed to serve 2 terms without giving up, which, given the state of Congress, is impressive. After Grant came Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the presidency through a backroom deal so convoluted it should have come with subtitles. The election of 1876 was tied, and the solution was basically, you can be president but end Reconstruction. So he did. Federal troops left the South, and within minutes, white supremacist governments slithered back into power. So much for progress. Hayes called it peace. History calls it retreat. And millions of freed Black Americans suddenly found themselves abandoned by the very nation that had promised them equality. Now, while politics sank into swampy boredom, the real action was happening in the economy. America industrialized faster than a sleepless inventor on too much coffee. Railroads crisscrossed the continent. Factories sprouted like weeds. Cities exploded in size and smell. And a new species emerged, the robber baron. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan made fortunes so enormous they could have built their own moons if they'd wanted to. They called it capitalism. Critics called it legalized looting. Rockefeller built Standard Oil, which controlled about 90% of the oil industry. Carnegie turned steel into a personal empire, then retired and gave most of it away, as if philanthropy were a cosmic refund. And J.P. Morgan, banker, monopolist, and human cigar cloud,
eventually became so rich he loaned money to the US government during a financial panic. Imagine the country being too broke to function, and some guy from Wall Street just saying, "Don't worry, I got this." It was a golden age, but only for a few. The rest of the country was mostly working 12-hour days in noisy factories, earning enough to afford bread, but not enough to afford breathing room. Labor unions began to form, slowly and angrily. Strikes broke out, and newspapers began to write about the money question, which was polite code for, why do 5 men own everything? Let's drift now to the cities. New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Towers of smoke, crowds, and endless noise. Immigrants poured in from Europe, drawn by the myth of opportunity. They found tenements, disease, and rent they couldn't pay. Still they stayed, because in America, hope was cheaper than food. If you could time travel to 1880s New York, you'd see something almost cinematic. Men in silk hats stepping over barefoot children on cobblestone streets. Women in corsets passing by factory girls with soot-stained faces. And political machines quietly pulling every lever behind the scenes. The most famous was Tammany Hall, run by the gloriously corrupt Boss Tude. He stole millions from New York's treasury and somehow still got elected multiple times. When finally arrested, he escaped to Spain. They caught him because locals recognized him from a political cartoon. That's right, America's most corrupt man was taken down by a doodle. Meanwhile, the presidency kept passing from one forgettable face to another. James Garfield was shot by a delusional office seeker and spent months slowly dying in bed, proving that medical science in 1881 was basically glorified guesswork. His successor, Chester Arthur A., surprised everyone by being competent. He cleaned up civil service corruption, redecorated the White House, and grew one of the most magnificent mustaches in presidential history. Then, he quietly died of kidney disease. Next came Grover Cleveland, a man so dull that historians still have to remind people he served 2 non-consecutive terms, which is technically interesting, but still somehow boring. Cleveland was honest to a fault. He vetoed everything that looked like government spending, which made him fiscally responsible and wildly unpopular. He also married his much younger ward while president, which raised eyebrows even in the 1880s, a decade not exactly known for its feminist instincts. Now let's take a soft turn into the culture of the age. This was when America discovered the idea of conspicuous consumption. If you had money, you showed it off, with mansions, banquets, and diamonds roughly the size of moral consequences. The Vanderbilts built palaces along Fifth Avenue. Carnegie built libraries everywhere, trying to atone for all the crushed unions. And ordinary people watched from afar, reading about it in glossy magazines that promised anyone could be rich if they just worked hard enough. Which, of course, wasn't true. Out west, things were a bit less gilded and a bit more dusty. The frontier still loomed. Cowboys, railroads, and land grabs galore. The government pushed westward expansion hard, usually at the expense of native tribes who'd already been pushed enough. By the 1890s, the frontier was officially declared closed, meaning there was nowhere left to expand. The dream of endless land was gone, replaced by the dream of endless wealth. As the century wound down, the cracks in the gold started to show. Economic depressions came and went, 1873, 1993, each one shaking confidence in the system. People began to question the gospel of business. Writers like Mark Twain and Henry Adams skewered the hypocrisy. Farmers formed movements demanding fair prices and currency reform. Workers marched for rights,
And yet the machine rolled on, smoother, louder, richer. The Gilded Age ended not with a bang, but with a yawn, gently fading into the Progressive Era, where people finally started saying, maybe monopolies are bad. So let's pause here in the soft hum of factories and the glitter of false prosperity. The country is rich, restless, and completely unaware that the next century will be far louder. But for now, it's nighttime over New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty's torch glows faintly through the smog. Somewhere, a millionaire clinks a champagne glass. Somewhere else, a factory whistle signals another midnight shift. The dream is still alive, gilded, cracked, and softly glowing.
Hey there, night listener. Welcome back to our long, sleepy tour through history's dim corridors. We've made it to the early 1900s, a strange time when America looked in the mirror, saw all its money, corruption, and inequality, and said, maybe we should do something about this. And then, naturally, argued for decades about what exactly something meant. This was the Progressive Era, roughly 1890 to 1920, a time when reformers, journalists, politicians, and a suspicious number of mustaches tried to clean up the mess the Gilded Age left behind. They called themselves progressives because slightly panicked moral improvers didn't fit on campaign buttons. Let's start with the mood. Cities were filthy, overcrowded, and buzzing with invention. The rich had their mansions, the poor had their basements. Child labor was normal, working conditions were appalling, and food safety was mostly theoretical. If you bought sausage in 1902, it probably came with bonus ingredients like sawdust, rats, or mild despair. Into this chaos stepped the muckrakers, journalists who poked into every scandal they could find. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, exposing the horrors of Chicago's meatpacking industry. He said he aimed for the public's heart, but hit their stomachs instead, which is both accurate and slightly disgusting. Ida Tarbell took down Rockefeller's oil monopoly with meticulous reporting. Jacob Riis photographed the tenements of New York, showing the world what progress really looked like when you couldn't afford sunlight. America started to realize that maybe, just maybe, unregulated capitalism wasn't the utopia everyone had hoped for. And then there were the presidents, a new kind of energetic, reform-minded leaders who actually did things. Starting with Theodore Roosevelt, who stormed into office in 1901 after President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist at the Buffalo World's Fair. McKinley's death was tragic, but it also made way for the most caffeinated president in U.S. history. Roosevelt was like if pure enthusiasm became a person. He hunted bears, boxed reporters, read a book a day, and gave speeches longer than most operas. He called the presidency his bully pulpit. Not bully as in mean, but as in excellent, though he could be both. He broke up corporate monopolies, regulated business, and created a fairer system of taxation. He also invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, which caused half the country to faint from scandal. Roosevelt didn't care. He just went back to his morning routine of wrestling corruption and occasionally literal wildlife. He was also the first president to understand media as performance. He staged photo ops, gave dramatic speeches, and turned politics into theater. It worked. People loved him. Even his critics had to admit he made government feel alive again, or at least awake. When Roosevelt finally decided to retire in 1909, he handpicked his friend William Howard Taft as his successor.
Taft was gentle, intelligent, and absolutely miserable as president. He preferred judges' chambers to campaign rallies. He was also famously large, over 300 pounds, and once got stuck in a White House bathtub, which probably wasn't his proudest moment, but has become his most enduring legend. Taft didn't have Roosevelt's energy, but he did continue many of his reforms, trust-busting, regulating business, and creating a fairer system of taxation. Unfortunately, Roosevelt grew impatient watching from the sidelines. He returned, ran against Taft in 2012, and split the Republican vote. This accidentally handed the presidency to Woodrow Wilson, a man so serious he could have made oatmeal look reckless. Wilson was intelligent, principled, and deeply self-righteous, which is a dangerous mix. He championed progressive reforms, the Federal Reserve, income tax, and the idea that government should protect the public good. He was also a professor, which meant his speeches sounded like homework. And of course, he resegregated the federal workforce, proving that even reformers can still be trapped in the past. Then came 1914, and the world quietly fell apart. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off World War I, a conflict so vast and pointless it practically redefined exhaustion. At first, Wilson kept America neutral. He campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Then, you guessed it, he took America to war the next year, because irony never sleeps. The U.S. joined the fight in 1917, sending troops, supplies, and a lot of optimism overseas. The war ended quickly after that, at least compared to the European bloodbath that came before. And when it did, Wilson imagined himself as the architect of a new, peaceful world order. He pushed for the League of Nations, a global council to prevent future wars, basically the United Nations before microphones existed. But when he brought the idea home, Congress said no thanks. Isolationism was back in fashion, and Wilson's dream died in committee. He suffered a massive stroke while still in office and spent the last year of his presidency half paralyzed, hidden from public view. His wife, Edith Wilson, quietly ran the country behind the scenes, America's first unofficial female president, though no one admitted it at the time. By the 1920s, progressivism had burned itself out. The world was tired. The soldiers came home, factories shifted back to peacetime work, and Americans wanted to forget the war, the reforms, the moral lectures. They turned instead to jazz, cocktails, and consumerism, because nothing says healing like a flapper dress and a Model T. The progressive era ended not with revolution, but with a shrug. Its victories written into law, its failures buried under the hum of a phonograph. So let's pause here. The air smells like cigarette smoke and new money. Electric lights flicker in city windows. America is modern now, but modern in that slightly confused way where people still use horse carts next to cars. The country has changed, undeniably. But beneath the progress, the same old contradictions hum quietly. Freedom versus control, wealth versus justice, idealism versus exhaustion. And as always, the Constitution keeps bending, adapting, surviving, like a very old blanket that somehow never quite tears. Next time, we'll wander gently into Part 8, the Roaring Twenties and the Great Crash, how America partied its way to a headache. So exhale, close your eyes, and picture it. Champagne bubbles, jazz drifting through smoke, and the faint sound of history counting down to another collapse. Because the dream isn't over. It's just getting louder before it falls asleep again.
The year is 1920. The war is over. The world is exhausted. And America, for the first time in its young life, feels like the center of the universe. Factories hum. Jazz spills out of every window. People are buying cars, radios, and hope. In monthly installments, of course. It's the roaring 20s, and everything seems to shimmer. But don't worry, we'll keep it slow. Even history's wildest decade sounds gentle when told at midnight. When the decade began, America elected Warren G. Harding, a man who looked like a movie president and governed like a sleepwalker. He promised a return to normalcy, which wasn't actually a word, but people liked the sound of it. After the war's chaos, normal sounded nice. Harding's version of normal included tax cuts for the rich, loose business regulations, and card games in the White House with whiskey, despite prohibition, the nationwide ban on alcohol that had just begun. The irony was delicious, literally. Because yes, in 1920, the U.S. passed the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol. It was supposed to purify society, to make people sober, moral, and industrious. Instead, it turned half the country into criminals. Speakeasies popped up behind every unmarked door. Jazz bands played under the clink of hidden glasses. Gangsters like Al Capone made fortunes supplying the very thing the law forbade. America was dry on paper, but drowning in gin. And if prohibition was the country's great contradiction, the Jazz Age was its glittering escape. New York, Chicago, and New Orleans pulsed with sound. Young people danced the Charleston, flappers cut their hair short, and musicians like Louis Armstrong turned brass into lightning. It was the first truly modern youth culture, loud, fast, unapologetically alive. Writers caught the rhythm too. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, a story soaked in champagne and melancholy. Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and Langston Hughes wrote about love, war, and identity in a world that suddenly felt unmoored. It was art born from speed, beauty tangled with exhaustion. And yet, behind the sparkle, there was a quiet ache. You see, the 1920s weren't just about freedom, they were about tension. The old world and the new world were colliding noisily. Women had just won the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. They were working, driving, and daring to live for themselves. It was thrilling, and it terrified traditionalists. Immigration brought new faces, new languages, and new fears. The Ku Klux Klan returned, now not just anti-black, but anti-everything. Immigrants, Catholics, Jews, progress, you name it. They marched in Washington in daylight, dressed like ghosts of the past, haunting the century's bright new stage. And meanwhile, in Tennessee, a young teacher named John Scopes went on trial for teaching evolution, the Scopes Monkey Trial, turning science and religion into national theater. America couldn't decide whether it wanted to move forward or retreat to the comfort of old certainties. Progress hummed, anxiety echoed underneath. Then came the money. The stock market turned into a national addiction. Everyone, rich or poor, wanted a piece of the booming future. Buy now, pay later became the motto of the age. Factories cranked out cars, radios, and refrigerators. Henry Ford's Model T made driving a right, not a luxury. Electricity reached millions of homes.
For the first time, Americans shared the same songs, same ads, same dreams, broadcast over radio waves that bound the nation together. But here's the quiet truth no one wanted to hear. The boom wasn't built to last. Farmers were in debt, wages didn't keep up with profits, and the stock market, that glittering promise of endless growth, was more balloon than foundation. Still, optimism is a powerful drug, and America was high on it. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The bubble burst. Stock prices crashed. Fortunes vanished overnight. Banks failed. Factories closed. Millions lost their jobs. The roaring stopped, and in that sudden silence, you could almost hear the country inhale, shocked, confused, afraid. The jazz age had danced itself breathless. It wasn't just an economic collapse, it was a spiritual one. The decade that had felt invincible ended in disbelief. The lights of Wall Street went dim, the champagne dried up, and history once again turned the lights on America's party. So here we are, drifting in that pause between noise and consequence. The 1930s are waiting just beyond the crash, darker, colder, but filled with resilience and quiet courage. The dream isn't gone. It's just learning to survive without music for a while.
The year is 1930. If you had a job, you held onto it like a lifeboat. If you had savings, you probably didn't anymore. And if you'd believed that endless prosperity was your birthright, well, the universe had other plans. It's easy now to think of the Great Depression as a kind of slow-motion disaster movie. But at the time, it wasn't loud. It was quiet. A creeping silence that spread from Wall Street ticker machines to small-town grocery stores. At first, people thought it would pass. Markets dip, markets recover. That's what they told themselves. But by 1931, it was clear. This wasn't a bad week. It was a whole new reality. Banks collapsed, not a few, thousands. People showed up to withdraw their savings only to find that the money wasn't there. In those days, your bank deposits weren't insured. When a bank failed, your money simply evaporated. You could see the panic in the lines that formed outside locked doors. Men in worn suits, women clutching empty purses, the air thick with disbelief. It wasn't just cash they'd lost, it was trust. Factories followed. Without credit, businesses couldn't borrow. Without borrowing, they couldn't pay workers. So the machines went quiet. By 1932, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. That's not a statistic. That's a silence that filled every street, every kitchen, every heart. People made do with what they could. Men sold apples on corners. Families moved in together. 3 generations under one sagging roof. Shantytowns sprang up on the edges of cities, collections of makeshift homes built from tin, cardboard, and stubborn hope. They called them Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, who seemed powerless to stop the collapse. It was cruel, maybe, but when you're hungry and angry, sarcasm comes easier than sympathy. Hoover believed in limited government, that the market would fix itself. He encouraged volunteerism and charity, but offered little direct aid. To the people freezing in Hoovervilles, that faith and self-reliance sounded like a bad joke. In Washington, he was calm. In breadlines, people were not. Meanwhile, nature joined the disaster. The Dust Bowl hit the Great Plains, a region already fragile from over-farming. Years of drought turned fertile soil into choking clouds of dust. Farmhouses vanished under drifts of dirt. Crops died, livestock starved, and families packed their lives into rickety trucks, heading west. They called them Okies, no matter where they were from. Tens of thousands drove toward California, hoping for work, warmth, anything. Many found only signs reading, "No jobs, keep moving." The Depression wasn't just economic, it was emotional. A generation that had grown up believing in progress suddenly met the limits of hope. But here's the strange thing about hopelessness. It doesn't last. Because when everything falls apart, the only thing left to do is rebuild. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933. A man with a calm voice, a cigarette holder, and a promise, a New Deal for America. Roosevelt didn't run from the crisis, he leaned into it. He spoke to people directly through the radio, his famous fireside chats where he'd explain complex policies as if he were talking across the kitchen table. It wasn't magic, but it sounded like reassurance. And sometimes, that's enough to start a recovery. The New Deal wasn't one law, but a flood of them. Programs to stabilize banks, to put people back to work, to regulate industry, to protect farmers. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees and building parks. The Works Progress Administration built roads, schools, bridges, even murals. The government for the first time became a kind of safety net. Not perfect, not complete, but something. For the first time, America began to see poverty not as a personal failure, but a collective problem. A shift in consciousness, slow, gentle, profound. And yet, even with all of that, recovery was uneven. Unemployment stayed high. Some New Deal programs clashed with the Supreme Court. Critics said Roosevelt was turning America socialist. Others said he wasn't going far enough. But for the people who'd spent years standing in bread lines, there was a sense of motion again. Faint, fragile, but real. Radio shows brought laughter back into living rooms. Movies offered escape. Musicals, gangster films, and screwball comedies, all pretending the world was fine for 2 hours at a time. Hollywood became America's dream factory, churning out joy in a time of scarcity. And across the ocean, darker clouds were gathering. While the U.S. rebuilt itself, Europe was unraveling again. Germany, crushed by debt and humiliation, looked for someone, anyone, to blame. A man named Adolf Hitler stepped forward, promising order, pride, and vengeance. In Italy, Mussolini had already been practicing the art of dictatorship. Japan's empire was expanding across Asia. The world has survived one global war and seemed to be quietly rehearsing for another. By the late 1930s, the Depression was easing, but only because rearmament and war production were picking up overseas. The storm was coming, and America, still catching its breath from one crisis, didn't quite realize it was about to walk into another. But that's how history works, isn't it? You barely finish patching one leak before the next wave hits. The Great Depression didn't end neatly, it shifted. From economic collapse to global conflict, from breadlines to battlefields. But it also left something enduring. A generation tougher than steel and gentler than they had any reason to be. They learned how to share when there was nothing to share. How to hope when hope felt like a luxury. It's quiet strength, the kind that doesn't make headlines but holds nations together. And as we drift to the edge of the 1940s, the world is about to change again. Factories that once sat idle will roar back to life. Men will march. Women will work. And America will, once again, find itself at the center of a storm it didn't start, but couldn't avoid.
By 1939, the world had already forgotten what never again was supposed to mean. Barely 20 years after the last Great War, Europe was marching back toward chaos. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles,
had found a new voice in Adolf Hitler, part dictator, part salesman, part nightmare. He promised Germany greatness, and people believed him, because despair makes good soil for delusion. Factories roared back to life, flags unfurled, and the march of boots echoed again through old streets. And then, on a gray September morning, German troops rolled into Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. Across the Atlantic, America watched. Still fragile from the Great Depression, most Americans wanted no part of another European mess. Isolationism wasn't just policy, it was exhaustion. President Franklin D. Roosevelt walked a tightrope. He understood that if Europe burned, the smoke would reach American shores sooner or later. But the country wasn't ready to hear that yet. So he talked carefully about neutrality, even while finding ways to help. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. sent ships, tanks, and supplies to Britain, not for free, of course, but with the faint air of friendship. It was like lending a neighbor your hose while pretending not to notice their house is on fire. Then came December 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning that shattered the illusion of distance. Japanese planes screamed out of the sky over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, battleships burned, thousands died, and America's isolationist dream went up in smoke. The next day, Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. And just like that, the U.S. was in the war, all in, all at once. World War II was unlike anything before it. It wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers, it was entire nations mobilized. Men were drafted, women filled factories, and even children collected scrap metal. The war effort turned every factory whistle into a battle cry. Rosie the Riveter rolled up her sleeves. The assembly line became the front line. Women welded, riveted, and proved, quietly and permanently, that they could do what men had always claimed was impossible. Ration books replaced shopping lists. Posters told people to plant victory gardens, to recycle, to shut up about troop movements. It was patriotism, yes, but also survival. The battlefields themselves were everywhere. Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and every one of them seemed to blur together into a long, gray grind. There were no quick victories, just endless marches, bitter winters, and names that still echo: Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, Iwo Jima. In Europe, Hitler's armies swept across the continent with terrifying efficiency. France fell, Britain endured, and in the shadows, something far worse than war was unfolding: the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, systematically murdered. It wasn't a battlefield, it was bureaucracy turned monstrous. Industrial killing designed by men in uniforms who filed paperwork and ate lunch afterward. Even now it's hard to comprehend, and yet that horror sits quietly beneath every other part of the story, an unerasable scar. But history, even at its darkest, moves. By 1943, the tide was turning. American and British forces landed in North Africa, then Italy. The Soviets, bloodied but unbroken, pushed westward from the ruins of Stalingrad. Factories back home were running day and night, producing tanks faster than they could be shipped. And after years of chaos, the war machine of democracy began to outbuild the war machine of tyranny. In June 1944 came D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of men, one impossible goal: reclaim Europe, one beach at a time. It worked somehow, and by the spring of 1945,
The walls of Hitler's empire were collapsing inward. He died in his bunker. Berlin fell. And in May, Europe exhaled. Victory in Europe. The war, at least half of it, was over. But across the Pacific, it raged on. Japan's empire still held vast territories and refused surrender. The fighting there was brutal beyond comprehension, jungle by jungle, island by island. Every inch of ground came at a human cost. Then, in August 1945, came something the world had never seen before and has feared ever since: the atomic bomb. The US dropped one on Hiroshima, then another on Nagasaki. Cities erased in seconds, mushroom clouds rising like terrible flowers into the sky. Hundreds of thousands dead, most of them civilians. And just like that, the war ended. Japan surrendered. The world stopped, stunned, silent, scorched. In total, over 60 million people died in World War II. Entire cities leveled, families erased. It was the deadliest event in human history, and somehow the beginning of a new era. When the smoke cleared, America found itself standing tall, its homeland untouched, its industry booming, its army victorious. But the victory came with a side effect: global responsibility. The United Nations was born. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. The GI Bill sent veterans to college, gave them homes, and accidentally created the American middle class. The war had made the US a superpower, and also a little uneasy about it, because from the ashes of Germany rose the West, and from the ashes of the Soviet victory rose something colder. The friendship between the US and the Soviet Union, forged out of necessity, cracked almost immediately. Mutual admiration turned into mutual suspicion. Two victors standing on opposite sides of a ruined world, each certain the other was about to ruin it again. That was the dawn of something new, something quieter, but somehow more dangerous: the Cold War. Nuclear weapons hummed in silos, ideologies glared across oceans, and the world, for all its new peace, couldn't quite sleep. But we'll let the bomb stay dormant for now. We'll pause here, at the edge of the atomic age, with the world rebuilding itself from ashes, factories humming again, and soldiers coming home to plant gardens where barracks used to stand. The lights are on again, but the hum beneath them, that quiet tension, will define the rest of the century.
Welcome back, night traveler. The world has just emerged from a global inferno. And yet, somehow, the fire hasn't really gone out. It's just quieter now, simmering under a veneer of normalcy, like coals in a fireplace after a long winter. By 1947, the United States and the Soviet Union had gone from wartime allies to wary adversaries almost overnight. The alliance against Hitler was convenient, temporary, and fragile, and once the common enemy was gone, old suspicions returned. The Cold War wasn't hot in the traditional sense. It was a battle of nerves, ideology, and patience. Instead of bullets and tanks, there were propaganda posters, espionage, and nuclear standoffs. Countries raced to stockpile weapons that could destroy the planet multiple times over, just in case. Americans built bomb shelters in backyards. Schools practiced duck-and-cover drills, crouching under desks as if a plywood table could stop a mushroom cloud. Meanwhile, Soviets did the same, in concrete bunkers, with a distinctly grim look on their faces. The world
had entered a perpetual state of mild panic. Politically, the era was defined by a series of leaders playing quiet chess across continents. Harry S. Truman oversaw the first years. Dropping the atomic bomb had already reshaped global power. The Truman Doctrine promised to contain communism anywhere it appeared, which mostly meant sending money and advisors to faraway countries nobody had ever visited. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, turning rubble into a kind of cautious optimism. And Truman had the pleasant task of watching as Germany was divided, Berlin walled off, and Eastern Europe quietly swallowed by Soviet influence. Then came Dwight Eisenhower, who liked golf, pithy statements, and keeping the Cold War cold. He warned of the military-industrial complex, suspecting that the same factories that built planes could eventually whisper, "More war, please," into government ears. And he was right. But he delivered it in such a calm, almost sleepy voice that most people barely noticed. Under his watch, the world became a subtle, tense game of posturing. Spies in every capital, propaganda films, nuclear tests in the desert, and silos full of doomsday missiles. Meanwhile, at home, Americans were living a peculiar duality. The 1950s were cheerful. Suburban expansion, TV dinners, Elvis, and cars with fins so big they could almost double as weapons. But beneath the clean lawns and shiny chrome, anxiety simmered. The Red Scare reached fever pitch. People suspected their neighbors, co-workers, even family members of secretly loving Stalin. Senator Joseph McCarthy became famous, or infamous, for accusing countless Americans of being communists, often with no evidence at all. Careers ended, friendships broke, and all of it happened in a calm, quiet, bureaucratic way that made the fear linger longer. Globally, proxy wars replaced direct conflict. Korea became a battlefield from 1950 to 1953. Americans fought communists, Soviets supplied them, and China joined in for good measure. Then Vietnam simmered as a long, draining conflict that would explode in the 1960s. The Cold War wasn't about conquest in the traditional sense. It was about influence, subtle domination, and the quiet threat of annihilation. And always, hovering over everything, was the nuclear sword, the ultimate sleeping giant. One of the eeriest moments came in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union installed nuclear missiles just 90 miles from Florida. The world froze. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged tense letters. Planes and submarines waited quietly. And for 13 days, the entire planet held its breath, knowing the slightest misstep could erase it all. It passed, mostly because both sides wanted to live, but it left a permanent undercurrent. Humanity had created tools so powerful that calm, careful reasoning was suddenly more important than courage or heroics. In the US, the Cold War shaped culture quietly but thoroughly. NASA was born because space became the next battlefield. School children memorized math and science, partly to outdo the Soviets. Movies depicted alien invasions and communist spies. Everything from comic books to board games carried a subtle lesson. The world is dangerous. Stay vigilant and never let your guard down. And yet life continued. People went to school. They bought cars.
They danced to rock and roll. They built the suburbs, watched TV, and tried not to think too hard about the mushroom clouds looming just beyond the horizon. The Cold War lasted decades, marked by cycles of tension and relief: the Korean War, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, arms races, and endless diplomatic maneuvers. No country won in the traditional sense. The war was fought mostly in whispers, calculations, and small, deliberate gestures. And eventually, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Communism in Eastern Europe collapsed. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991. The Cold War ended, quietly, with minimal fanfare, like a tide finally receding after decades of gentle but relentless pressure. For America, the Cold War was exhausting. It reshaped politics, culture, and foreign policy. It drove innovation, satellites, computers, even microwave ovens. And it left a lingering sense of vigilance, a habit of watching, calculating, and preparing for a danger that may never come. But it also taught patience, the ability to endure long periods of tension without chaos, to navigate fear with routine, to sleep, mostly, while the world waited.
Welcome back, night traveler. We've crossed the century of fire, smoke, and steel. We've watched nations collapse, rise, and tremble under the weight of their own ambitions. Now it's time to step lightly into the era we recognize, the one with suburbs, televisions, space travel, and the occasional inexplicable fad. The post-Cold War era begins gently in the 1990s. The Soviet Union has dissolved, leaving America as the sole superpower. It's a world of possibility, optimism, and, of course, slow economic anxiety that most people ignore until it hits. Politically, the U.S. experimented with presidents of many stripes. John F. Kennedy, in the early 1960s, exuded calm confidence and televised charm. He faced down nuclear crises with the Soviets, inspired a nation with speeches about the moon, and, tragically, was assassinated in 1963. The country collectively paused, mourned, and somehow moved forward, leaving the world slightly more fragile and introspective. Lyndon J. Johnson inherited the mantle, pushing through sweeping civil rights legislation while escalating the Vietnam War. The 1960s became a decade of tension at home. Protests, assassinations, and cultural revolutions that reshaped how Americans thought about freedom, morality, and music. The 1970s brought economic turbulence. Inflation, oil crises, and the lingering shadow of Vietnam created a quiet anxiety. President Nixon resigned in 1974, proving that even the most powerful nation struggles to manage secrets and that political hubris can quietly topple a presidency. Jimmy Carter followed, earnest, moral, and quietly exasperated. He wrestled with the energy crisis, hostage situations abroad, and a national mood that was mostly tired. It was an era of slow progress, quiet innovation, and a lot of soft-spoken frustration. Then came the 1980s, bright, bold, and a little flashy. Ronald Reagan, the actor turned president, projected calm strength with a smile and a cinematic voice. He expanded the military, confronted the Soviets rhetorically, and managed to usher the world toward the end of the Cold War without dropping another bomb on American soil. He famously said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and the world listened, slowly, inevitably. Meanwhile, culture shifted. Cable TV, personal computers, and MTV created a new kind of soft global rhythm. People danced, watched, and consumed information faster than ever before, quietly preparing society for the digital age without really noticing. The 1990s were calm on the surface, but electric underneath. The internet began to spread, connecting people, ideas, and commerce in ways previously unimaginable. People voted, protested, innovated, and tweeted in real time, building a collective consciousness that is louder, faster, and sometimes quieter in reflection than anything that came before. Then came the 2000s, a new century, new fears, and the realization that peace is always temporary. The 9/11 attacks in 2001 shook the nation in a way that was both sudden and slow-burning. Buildings fell, thousands died, and a new era of vigilance began. The world changed, quietly, permanently, under the weight of terrorism, wars abroad, and surveillance at home. The country responded with military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, reshaping the global landscape. Economically, the 2008 financial crisis reminded Americans that wealth and stability are fragile even in the 21st century. Millions lost homes, jobs, and savings, proving once again that the patterns of boom and bust are persistent and patient. Culturally, the modern era is dizzying. Social media connects billions, news travels instantly, and trends come and go before the coffee is finished. People vote, protest, innovate, and tweet in real time, building a collective consciousness that is louder, faster, and sometimes quieter in reflection than anything that came before. Yet, amidst the speed and noise, the patterns of history remain recognizable. Nations rise and fall, slowly, unpredictably. Leaders fail and succeed, usually at the margins of public perception. The people endure, quietly, creatively, resiliently. Technology accelerates life, but it doesn't change human nature. Greed, ambition, curiosity, fear, and hope continue to pulse under the surface, guiding the steps of history as subtly as a lullaby guides a sleeper into dreams. Today, as we step lightly into the 2020s, the world is interconnected, complicated, and, like every era before it, fragile. Pandemics, climate change, political unrest, and cultural revolutions remind us that nothing lasts forever, except the constant rhythm of human persistence. The United States, like every nation before it, continues to navigate triumphs and failures, successes and regrets, dreams and disappointments. And quietly at night, history hums beneath the surface, a long, continuous story that never really ends. So as we drift toward the present, remember this: history is not always loud, dramatic, or violent. It's sometimes quiet, cumulative, and soft, like a slow, steady heartbeat beneath the everyday noise. And that, dear listener, is how the story of America reaches the modern era. Resilient, flawed, remarkable, and ready to keep sleeping, dreaming, and waking up again. With that, we've reached the gentle edge of the 21st century. The nation is awake, but resting. The past is long. The future is soft and uncertain. And as always, the lull of history continues. If you want, I can now craft part 13, a reflective epilogue that wraps up this 1.5-hour sleep-inducing monologue, tying together the centuries of American history with that calm, slightly wry bedtime narrative.
Here we are, finally, at the gentle end of our journey, or at least the edge of the story we've told tonight. From the drafting of the Constitution, with its arguments, compromises, and occasional confusion, to the complex, humming world of today, history has moved slowly, quietly, sometimes clumsily, like a river winding through landscapes it didn't choose. America's story isn't tidy. It's messy, ironic, and full of contradictions. Some presidents were brilliant, some were terrifyingly mediocre. Some laws healed, others hurt. Some wars were necessary, others less so. Yet the country endured, and that endurance is almost its own form of quiet heroism. Think back. The Constitution, written by men who disagreed constantly, yet created something that still functions. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, periods of wealth, corruption, reform, and moral panic, showing that society always swings between excess and moderation. The Roaring Twenties and Great Depression, a vivid reminder that humans can celebrate, despair, and survive, often all at once. World War II, smoke, steel, and sacrifice, proving both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. The Cold War, decades of subtle tension, paranoia, and patient vigilance, a quiet lesson in endurance. The modern era, innovation, complexity, connectivity, and the ever-present hum of both hope and anxiety. Every era was built on the failures and achievements of the last. Every generation learned something, sometimes painfully, sometimes quietly, sometimes in ways they didn't notice until decades later. And yet, in all this, there is something remarkably soothing, because history, when told like this, slowly, gently, without clamor or dramatic flourishes, becomes a lullaby. It's a reminder that the world moves on, that mistakes are made and corrected, that progress and regression coexist. It's the quiet rhythm of people, nations, and ideas moving through time, like a soft, constant tide. Even in chaos, there is continuity. Even in despair, there is resilience. Even in the darkest moments, there is the hum of human persistence, steady as a heartbeat beneath the surface of daily life. So, as we close the long night of storytelling, imagine America as it has always been, a country of ambition and flaw, of triumph and quiet mistakes, of people who try, fail, and try again. A place where history whispers in every corner, in old buildings, dusty documents, and the echoes of voices long gone. A story that is never truly finished, because the next day, the next century, the next moment of human endeavor continues its slow, unbroken narrative. And now, dear listener, you can rest. Let your mind drift through centuries, past presidents, factories, battles, and breakthroughs. Let it float over smoky battlefields, dusty tenements, jazz-filled streets, and modern skylines. And know that just like history itself, you can exhale, pause, and keep moving forward, quietly, steadily, persistently. Good night. The story continues, softly, endlessly, like the quiet turning of a page.